Right. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this sort of lunchtime session. Feel free to eat your sandwiches while watching. My name is Farah Hussain. I'm a Labour councillor in the London Borough of Redbridge. I'm also a PhD student at Cllr, and I worked on the report which Carl Pike did a very short presentation on at the beginning of the day. So welcome to our panel here today, which is discussing how we can use history to create a platform for the future in the Labour Party. So we have three brilliant panelists, and I will introduce them now. So first of all, we've got Steve Fielding. Steve is an academic in the School of Politics at the University of Nottingham, where he's Professor of Political History and Director of the Centre for British Politics. His most recent work, A State of Play, sets out the qualified constructivist view that how individuals regard real politics can be shaped by fictional works about politics. He also has other books which include The Wilson Governments, England Arise, Churchill Myths, and is a contributor to Nathan's book. Next, we have David Eggerton. Professor David Eggerton is an English historian and an educator. He is the Hans-Rousing Professor of the History of Science and Technology and Professor of Modern British History at King's College London. He is one of Britain's leading historians and has published a number of influential books over the last 20 years, which include The Rise and Fall of the British Nation. Lastly, we have Patrick Diamond. Patrick is a senior lecturer in public policy at Queen Mary, University of London. He's chair of the think tank Policy Network. He is also the Gwilym Gibbon Fellow at Nuffield College in Oxford and is a visiting fellow in the Department of Politics at the University of Oxford. Patrick is the director of the Myland Institute at Queen Mary. So we have a really great panel to discuss Labour history and also how we can use that history going forward. And that's probably more than enough for me, and I'll pass over to Steve.
Right, thanks very much. Well, all political parties are future-orientated organisations. They all want to win the next election. And Labour is no exception, of course. Although for a party that's often described as being stuck in it, the institution has had really very little interest in its own past, let alone, for want of a better term, weaponising it on its own behalf. And that's been especially true of those modernisers, and that's obviously a very loaded term, a significant term, who emerged out of the 1980s in battles with the party's far left to try and make the party more electorally relevant. So in 1990, Tony Blair told Labour's annual conference delegates that they should, quote, leave the past to those that live in it. And the whole new-old Labour dichotomy revealed, a basic truth, maybe amongst modernisers, progressives, the party as an institution as a whole, that they saw little value in the past. It was an encumbrance, almost an embarrassment in some respects. And as Keir Starmer said, actually this morning, he was interested in what happened. He wasn't interested in what happened in the past. He was forward-looking. Right. So that means, however, that history has been left to their enemies. Enemies on the left and enemies on the right. The consequences of which we can see today. Brexit, that was partly fueled by a highly flawed vision of what 1940 was all about, of standing alone. We've got Boris Johnson's appropriation of Churchill for all kinds of reasons. His own government's war on woke, the battle over statues, the content of museums, and also Jeremy Corbyn's appropriation of the spirit of 1945 and his bogus embodiment of the party's authentic tradition, right? So all of these are evidence of the extent to which history has been put by many successful political projects. It's an example of soft power, of the soft power that history embodies, and how they've used it to attract, co-opt and shape people's preferences, they've all got a historical element. They've all got a historical take, which they promote. So while history doesn't win elections, it can help create the context for the winning of elections. And I would say that history, is really just an intrinsically political thing. And especially now that culture and so the politics of meaning is of more importance than ever before. So as a result of leaving history very much to your antagonists, the challenge of reversing the consequences of this are immense. And I've just two very brief examples just to show you the scale of this. Everybody bangs on about Winston Churchill, right? What about Clement Attlee? Why does nobody talk about Clement Attlee? In 2002, Churchill was elected the greatest Briton by BBC viewers. Clement Attlee didn't even reach the top 100. God only knows where he was. That means more people thought that Julie Andrews, that David Beckham, Robbie Williams were greater Britons than the man whose government had introduced an NHS. And they're very comparable figures, though, however, Churchill and Attlee. One defended Britain against Hitler, albeit with Attlee's support and the Labour Party's support, which always gets missed out. And Attlee's government made Britain safe from the consequences of ill health, right? So why is Attlee? Why does nobody talk about Attlee? And in fact, in 2020, when YouGov asked Labour members who they thought their greatest leader was, while Attlee was placed quite high, 1/3 of Labour members said they didn't know enough about Attlee to have an opinion, right? That's Labour members, right? So there's been a huge failure there about Attlee in relation to Churchill. But also, what kind of an Attlee are we talking about when Labour members think of Attlee? And what I would just like to point out is that during Ed Miliband's leadership and under Jeremy Corbyn in particular, there was a revival of interest, or at least a use of Attlee on T-shirts or whatever. And partly this was thanks to Ken Loach's film, The Spirit of 45, which was released in 2013, which was an audacious and very clever attempt by the hard left to appropriate the Attlee government and what they did, and Attlee himself to some extent, to their own cause, right? And ironically, or not, Loach wasn't even a member of the Labour Party in 2013. And when he launched Left Unity, his own organisation, which stood candidates against Labour in 2015, he actually said that Left Unity was now the best embodiment of Clement Attlee. I mean, it's a really clever film, and moderates, progressives might want to see that and maybe try to emulate it. It's a very clever thing. But then Jeremy Corbyn became the embodiment of Clement Attlee as far as many members were concerned. And of course, reality is rather different, at least many people's take. So those two examples strongly suggest that you do need to take the past much more seriously if you want to prosper in the future, because your antagonists are already using the past against you. So if you do leave the past, as Tony Blair said to those that live in it, you'll find you don't have much of a future. And the thing is, there is a positive and relevant story that Labour could tell about itself to promote the idea of the party, which is actually very relevant today, a party that is radical and patriotic, one that has embodied the best of Britain. But it's no good just peppering speeches with references to 1945, because most people out there don't know what you're talking about. And many members in your own party, your own antagonists believe they're the best embodiments of 1945 and you're not, right? So all I would say I'm ending now, I think that's more than my 3 minutes, but it'd be interesting to know what practical ways history can be used to promote the party, a certain vision of the party, but I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks so much, Steve. I think you raised some really interesting points and I was like scribbling away with my thoughts. And I think hopefully David and Patrick will give us some ideas that answer the questions that you've raised, but I'm really interested in hearing from the audience as well about your ideas in answer to Steve's questions. But now we'll move on over to David. So I'll hand over to you.
Lovely, thank you very much indeed. Well, I certainly agree very strongly with Stephen that the Labour Party has left the national past certainly to the Tories, and and that has been disastrous for its politics. I want to think very specifically now about how one judges the success of the Labour Party over the last century. In our Westminster-centric system, it's little surprise that success is measured by achieving a majority in Parliament. And actually, only 3 Labour leaders have achieved that: Attlee, Wilson, and Blair. Labour has only twice been the largest party without a majority, in the 1970s, in 1929, under McDonnell and Wilson. We might also ask, who are the Labour leaders who have deprived the Tories of a majority without being the largest party? They were MacDonald, Brown, and Corbyn. There's a much longer list of people who failed to do that: Henderson, Attlee, Gateskill, Wilson, Callaghan, Kinnock, Miliband, and Corbyn. But if one is interested in measuring the degree of connection with the people, the reaching out, support the party received, the number of seats, ability to form a government are not a good measure. This is for the very obvious and well-known reason that we have a first past the post system. For much of the time, but not always, this results in a wild disproportion between support and seats. Now, for Labour, the extent and direction of this disproportion has changed radically over elections. We can put it this way: at certain periods, the main determinant of the electoral success of Labour has not been electoral support for Labour, but the quantity and distribution of support for other parties. So Labour doesn't always deserve credit for winning, nor blame for losing. What's interesting about 2017 and 2019 is that in both cases, the seat share was very close to the vote share for Labour, that is. This has previously happened only between 1951 and 1959, and in 1923. Otherwise, the story is a very significant disproportion. It was extraordinarily negative in the 1930s, especially in 1931, when 30% of the vote yielded 8% of seats. By contrast, it was extraordinarily positive in 1997 to 2005. Labour won a landslide in 1997 with a vote share just lower than that which led to a loss in 1970. As the 1935 result has been repeatedly referred to recently, including today, it's worth looking a little more at that one. In fact, it was Labour's best performance in vote share for the entire interwar period. It also saw an increase in the number of seats. Labour got 38% of the vote, but just 25% of the seats. Give or take 1 point, 38% was the Labour share in 2 elections in 1974 and in 1979. In 1974, that resulted first in a minority government, then a small majority government, and in 1979, of course, a loss. That 1935 share was 3 percentage points better than that of 2005, when Labour got the majority. To continue this theme, a better share in 2017 than 2005 gave Labour increased seats compared with 2015, but in 2017, it was not even the largest party. And in 2019, Labour did better in share than in 2010 and 2015, of course, worse in seats. The reason was that for no fault of its own, the system and distribution of support others was no longer giving Labour more seats than its share implied. If we take the 1997 vote share as a benchmark, we can see that Labour equaled or beat that in every general election from 1945 to 1970. In 1987, Blair did as well, but no better than Gateskill in 1959, who of course lost. The really big Labour successes with 3 percentage points more than in 1997 include the famous 1945 election, but also 1951, when Labour achieved its greatest vote share ever, but lost, and 1966, which is the most forgotten Labour success of all. In the years between 45 and 70, the Labour vote never fell below 43% vote share. Since then, this was only exceeded once in 1997 and approached only twice, in 2001 and 2017, with 40%. And looking to the future, how might we reflect on this past? Well, perhaps this is the way to think about it. There was a unique period between 45 to 70 when the vote share hovered between 43 and 48%. This was without question Labour's great period of electoral, political, and social and economic success. The only moment when it consistently got a majority of the working class vote, though not a very large majority of that vote. What needs to be emulated, it seems to me, is that record of getting support, transforming the country, and keeping the support, not least while in office. Labour's greatest success, tellingly after years of government, came in 51. And the only other time that Labour's increased its vote after being in office was really 1966, one could argue 74 as well. Labour has not achieved anything like this since. And the picture since 1970 is really very different from that 45 to 70 picture. Since then, the electorate has been fickle, as was said this morning, but in long ways. Share has oscillated between 43% and less than 30%. From 1970 to 1983, there was a collapse in vote share, and the same thing happened in another 13-year period between 1997 and 2010. From the peak of 2017, 2019 saw a major fall. The question might be, is this fall to continue for more elections, as the record post-1970 and post-1997 suggests? Will recent history repeat itself? Are we going downhill all the way to 2030? Well, let us hope not. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. And I'm glad that you managed to end on some sort of positive after that list.
I tried.
And now I'll pass over to Patrick.
Hi, Farah. Well, it's great to be with you, and I will try to retain at least some of the sense of optimism that David ended his contribution with. So I'm not a professionally trained historian, but I do want to obviously talk this afternoon about some of the ways in which I think history can be a useful resource, and the ways in which I've used it, both in my work as a policy advisor and subsequently as an academic political scientist. I want to begin, though, and this, I think, in a sense, speaks to my point about optimism, by arguing that I think on the face of it, at least, there appears to be something of a welcome revival of interest in Labour history on the centre-left in Britain. And I was reflecting earlier today that in the post-war period, one could argue Labour was dominated intellectually by economists. Key figures in the party like Hugh Dalton, Hugh Gateskill, Harold Wilson, Anthony Crosland, Barbara Wootton, Douglas Jay, and so on, were all essentially trained in the discipline and theory of economics. When we get to New Labour in the 1990s, New Labour's intellectual dominance, insofar as it achieved it, was really achieved by turning to the work of sociologists. And New Labour was marked by the dominance of sociologists. Anthony Giddens, of course, whose work is very well known. Within government, figures like Jeff Mulgan, and also the LSE social policy experts who contributed so much to Labour's thinking about social and economic policy. And we can look at the sorts of concepts that New Labour developed in this period, sociological concepts like social exclusion and the knowledge economy, which really just further underline the significance and dominance of sociology within the thinking of the party. However, as I say, I think in recent years, we're seeing signs of a renewed interest in the party's history, and also in the use of history as a discipline for thinking about the problems and challenges of the present. And of course, one example of this turn to history can be seen in the contributions of senior Labour politicians themselves. It's very striking that two of the most senior figures in the current shadow cabinet, Rachel Reeves and Nick Thomas-Symonds, the Shadow Chancellor and Shadow Home Secretary, respectively, have both published major historical works. Nick Thomas-Symonds, of course, has published books on Bevan and Attlee, and Rachel Reeves has published several books on the history of women in the Labour Party. And so I think in the policy debate and the political debate that Labour's now having, the work of historians clearly is figuring more largely in that discussion. And I think David Edgerton's work and his book, The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, is just one other example of that. I would argue, though, Farah, that the revival of historical interest in the Labour Party is also necessary for two fundamental reasons. I think the first reason is that history enables us to understand better the challenges and problems of the present. And I think this is a very pertinent issue given Labour's current electoral weakness and the discussion around it, which of course has been, in a sense, deepened by the results of the elections last Thursday. Much is being written about the party's detachment from its core electorate and its failure to construct a viable electoral coalition. But of course, Labour's uneasy relationship with those it considers its core voters is nothing very new at all. A large segment of the English working class have never voted Labour, even in the 1930s and the 1940s, arguably the heyday of British Labourism. And throughout the post-war history, throughout Britain's post-war history, in the wake of the Attlee government's defeat, leading figures repeatedly posed the question, must Labour lose? The title of a pamphlet, of course, published in 1960. Both the 1950s and the 1980s in particular were periods in which it was believed that structural economic change and alterations in the class composition of society would erode Labour's electoral base to the point that it might never win again. And yet the party did eventually recover. And so, if nothing else, history helps us to temper the descent into eternal pessimism. The other reason why, though, I think history is so necessary and so important in thinking about the challenges facing the Labour Party is that as Labour embarks on the task of forging a new post-pandemic, post-Brexit political project, history can help to anchor the party in its core traditions. I think in many ways, New Labour never understood this. The prefix new was used to separate the modernisers from everything that had gone before. This was a year zero view of history. The entire post-war period was conceived as a disaster, with the possible exception of the Attlee years, as Steve was saying earlier. Old Labour was state planning, nationalisation, overmighty trade unions, the winter of discontent, paternalistic local government, the crisis of the 1970s. And yet any cursory review of Labour's history suggests that old Labour was many other things as well. Crossland's revisionism in the aftermath of World War II, Wilson's powerful appeal to national modernisation in the 1960s, Callaghan's reappraisal of policy in the 1970s, symbolised by his powerful speech at Ruskin College in Oxford on the future of education. So New Labour's disavowal of the party's past, I would argue, made it look rootless, a departure from the party's core traditions, and it merely encouraged the damaging perception that New Labour was in fact an aberration. The New Labour modernisers refused to learn from earlier generations of modernisers in the party. And so New Labour failed to appreciate that the past provides a rich set of resources from which political projects are forged. And as I say, and I'll conclude now, Farah, as the party looks to the future and looks to fashioning a new political project for the society and economy in which we're living today, it is precisely, in my view, by drawing on this rich set of resources that it can fashion a political project that both has more appeal and also more depth and hopefully longevity. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks to all of you for those really interesting thoughts on the dilemmas that the current Labour Party faces and how we can look to the past to help us get through them. I have a couple of questions myself, but for the audience members, feel free to add your questions to the chat box and I'll read them out. And just to let you know that this meeting is being recorded, and I'm not sure if the chat is included in that, but just be aware that anything you put in the chat might be recorded, so don't put anything not broadcastable. So I think the sort of main question that comes out to me is how it's all right us sitting in this room online having discussions about Labour Party history, but how do we have those conversations with people on the doorstep? How do we let the public know? Is that even the point of this? Should we discuss the history, our history, with the public, or is it more something that we should think about internally as a party to help us figure out what we're doing? If I hand over to David first.
Yes, I do think it's something for the for everyday campaigning, but I think it's something for speeches, and it's something for internal political education for sure. I very much agree with Stephen that Labour is missing tricks here. And we've got to get away from the cliches, the cliches of Churchill and World War II, the cliches of the white heat, the cliches of tax and spend. The cliche, and it is that Labour is the party of welfare. It's much more than that. In fact, it's only really the party of welfare in 1959 and under New Labour. So I think there's a further task, which is not to reproduce the standard old histories which are out there, many of which are not especially politically helpful. They're histories of written in a particular era, essentially the 1960s and 1970s. But yes, I think it would be tremendously interesting, not least actually as a way of bringing wings of the party together. I mean, I think there is a lack of understanding of the evolution, the complicated evolution of the relations between the right and left of the Labour Party that could be discussed fruitfully in comradely fashion through a revised history. That is probably asking too much, but one needs to be hopeful.
Thanks, David. Steve?
Well, I think that you do have to look at it in terms of there are two things going on. The party, I think, needs to embed itself nationally in a more confident vision of its place in British history, and link that with what it wants to do today. Because there's no point just talking about the past just for its own sake. It's people like me. That's why I'm paid money. But the party wants to make the past work for it in the present and into the future. And I think it's largely evacuated that whole territory. That was the point of doing the Churchill-Attlee contrast. I mean, it is just remarkable how little is known about Clement Attlee. But so it could very easily, I mean, and it would have to be done at the national level. Talking to people about Labour's past on the doorstep, as probably lots of people in this room probably know, there's no point talking to people on the doorstep in many cases because you're not going to be able to convince them. But this should be done at the national level. And I've just noticed, and Keir Starmer's not alone in being guilty of this, but in his speeches about COVID and about the impact of COVID, he says it's like another 1945 moment. Well, it's no good saying that when, like I said in my talk, people don't really know what that means. And what did Labour do in 1945, and how does that link to what they want to do now? And obviously the story of the NHS could be a really useful one. And what Attlee was trying to do, patriotic at one level, radical on another, the sort of things Labour wants to talk about at the moment, at least. It's their responsibility, it's the National Party's responsibility to take that on board. And within the party itself, I mean, there'll be lots of people here in the audience who will have experience about Labour Party meetings and how potentially fractious they can be. And they're very strong ideas about what the party stands for. And many of them are just based on myths. And they're not really based on a close knowledge of what's been going on or what has gone on. And I think if we could have a kind of a sensible discussion around certain issues that the parties, about the party's past, present, and present policies. I mean, the party's record on various issues is not totally positive. I mean, the point for the party discussions is, well, let's look at the issue, say, of immigration and how has the party dealt with and ethnic minorities. How has the party dealt with it in the past? What was the reasons for that? How might it learn from that experience? And try to have, and I know in a Labour Party context, it's almost futile to say it, to try to have it in a just non-partisan way as possible. But that has to be carefully shaped by how it's done. But I think having kind of discussions once in a while, because monthly ward meetings, sometimes you're getting people in to really tell you about the nuts and bolts about something which could be important, but it's a bit boring sometimes. Having something about the party's past could in fact be quite an engaging thing, but it has to be done in a particular way. So I think there's lots of scope because the party's done nothing about this, really. And so the field of opportunity is huge. It's just a question of whether the party really wants to do it.
Yeah.
Thanks. Patrick?
Not much to add beyond what the other two speakers have said. Shabir posted a very good comment in the chat, I thought, which said something to the effect of, if someone knocked on my door and started talking about Labour history, I wouldn't be very happy about it, which I think many of us who've knocked on doors and been activists and campaigned in elections is a reflection that I'm sure we'd probably all agree with. Having said that, you know, I think as this conversation reveals, I think history is just an incredibly useful resource in thinking about the challenges facing the party, how the party can develop a message that unites its different wings. I would also say that I think policy history is really important. I mean, in many ways, the 1997 to 2010 government has been either eulogised or dismissed. Those are two kind of extreme positions. And I think actually we have to engage in a much deeper discussion about what was successful and what was less successful about that period, what worked and what didn't, a much more rounded understanding of the structural weaknesses of that government, but also obviously its successes. And I think history is clearly a very valuable disciplinary perspective in doing that. So, you know, I think there are lots of ways in which history can continue to be very important to us, even if, as was rightly said, we perhaps don't want to knock on people's doors and start discussing it with them on Sunday mornings.
Thanks, Patrick. And you actually answered my next question with that answer, which is useful in terms of timekeeping. Obviously, it feels like the $1 million question in the Labour Party is, how do we talk about the Blair government? And I was wondering what ideas Steve and David have about how we can do that as a party, especially when there are people who voted 2 weeks ago, last week, who weren't born in 1997. So how do we have those conversations? And I'm just going to quickly sneak in so you can answer 2 in 1. We're all academics here, or the 4 of us are academics who work on the Labour Party. There are lots of people who are interested in this topic. How should the party engage with academics, both in history and political science and other disciplines? And how could they build that knowledge into the things that they do? So I'll pass over to Steve first.
Yeah. Well, I actually curated an exhibition at the People's History Museum on the 20th anniversary of 1997. So I actually did, you know, something about what New Labour, you know, what about the New Labour government, and of course had to be very careful about it not being partisan, you know. So I couldn't go, oh, it was all great, oh, it was all marvellous, did all this, did all the other. I mean, because one of the things I find very, very remarkable is one of the many criticisms. I mean, Ed Miliband's very criticised leader, but one of the criticisms that has been made against him is that, oh, you should never have criticised the last Labour government. That's a terrible thing that you should do. And I said that's not the kind of attitude that I think should be adopted when it comes to Labour's history, because Labour did some good things, and it did some not so good things, and it didn't do lots of things that maybe it should have done. So in terms of thinking about New Labour, it's thinking about, well, understanding the context from which it was coming about. I mean, why was Tony Blair in Labour sort of having to come to terms with the market? What were the politics of it? Did they just decide, oh, we better do this because we're like evil, you know, we're evil neoliberals? There was a reason for why they did those things. And then to understand, well, what were they trying to do? They were still trying to make society fairer. They did, although, you know, we know about child poverty. We know that in some instances that inequality was reduced, but that in other instances, the top 1%, they just went off on their own little mission. So there are things it did well, things it didn't do so well. Let's just try and have a reasoned debate about that. Now, in the Labour Party context, as you know, there'll be people who are just implacably opposed to it. But if we can have, I mean, I'm in a ward Labour Party, and we've got Corbynites, we've got people on the soft left and people from Progress, and we somehow manage not to shout at each other all the time. It is possible to have a reasoned debate about some of these things, but it's all about framing it and just thinking about it. But that's within the Labour Party itself. I mean, others might have their view about it as I kind of talk about it too, when there are others in the room who aren't Labour members.
David?
Well, I don't really want to answer the question specifically on the Blair years. I think every Labour government has seen extraordinary controversy about whether it's been a success or a failure. And that certainly includes the 45 government. I mean, many people on the left thought that went very badly, actually, not simply running out of steam, but involved a kind of buying into a conservative Britain that the left should reject. So I think we just need to recognise that Labour is a fractious party, and not as good as kind of hiding its divisions as the Tory party. But I think we have to accept that and essentially try and raise the level of the debate. And as Stephen said, we shouldn't go around thinking that one half of the party is evil or stupid or backward-looking or too forward-looking. We need really to understand where people are coming from, and I think that needs sort of openness towards all traditions in the Labour Party. And one of the things that worries me is the systematic kind of lack of understanding, echoing Stephen here, of other people's positions. And frankly, that's bad not just internally, but also in terms of national politics. I mean, the failure to understand the nature of the Tory party, the failure to understand the kind of nature of the British economy and British society, it goes right across the party, and is deeply damaging. So I see the internal Labour problem as a bigger problem in microcosm. I suppose I would put it this way, that I think if we had everybody just reading Labour manifestos from the past, I think most Labour members and probably most Labour MPs would be shocked at 90% of the content of every single manifesto. And I think actually reading manifestos is a better place to start than most history books on this question. For example, one will not find the welfare state in the 1945 Labour manifesto. Or the phrase isn't there, and actually the social services and all the things we might think of as the welfare state aren't particularly present. Actually, that's a bit of a shock, isn't it? Manifestos are full of shocks of that sort. Harold Wilson won in '64 on a position on nuclear weapons, which would be, well, what is certainly far to the left. Left-right is the right distinction here of Jeremy Corbyn. Far to the left. How many people know that? I think this is where we can begin to have a grown-up conversation.
And how should the party engage with those conversations?
I'm sorry, you asked us about historians. Yes.
Should there be a Labour Party historian?
I think that's a kind of administrative technical issue which will just resolve itself in the blink of an eye once Labour decides that it wants to think historically, use history actually. So there are lots of people out there. The one general point I'd say actually is it's a real shame that in our universities, what one might call political history, and certainly the history of the Labour Party, isn't as well represented in curricula as it might be. And I think that's something that Labour could just start talking about actually, and encourage people to study British political history.
I
don't know what Stephen and Patrick think about that point, but perhaps I don't want to be out on a limb on that one.
Well, I would just add very quickly.
You might have a.
Yes, I was just going to add.
I think I've got.
Just going to add quickly on this theme about the question of how Labour uses history to think about its recent past. So at the Mile End Institute, we're currently discussing a proposal to hold a conference on the 25th anniversary of the 1997 Labour victory, which would be next year, of course. But I think it's just important and reflects some of what's been said in this discussion so far. Hosting such a conference is not a straightforward exercise, because the kinds of questions that you need to pose and the sorts of themes that you need to consider are clearly far richer and go beyond just the fact that Labour won that election by many, many seats. It's not just historically important because Labour won a large majority of 179 seats and governed for 13 years. It's important for lots of other reasons, for what it tells us about the nature of Britain at that time, for what it tells us about the effect of the end of the Cold War, for what it tells us about where Britain was going economically and socially at the end of what had been a very severe recession in the early 1990s, Britain's relationship with Europe. And also, I think those themes are in some ways very much, of course, an elite account of history. We also need in that 1997, 25 years on conference to think about what were party members and local Labour parties thinking around the 97 period. What was the grassroots of the Labour movement and the trade unions thinking about and considering and debating? And we also need to think about the different identities that were represented in the party. Those, of course, are about different national identities, Scotland, Wales, England, Northern Ireland. They're also, of course, about other questions of gender and ethnicity. So just thinking about that conference, Farah, makes me realise, makes me appreciate the subtle way in which we need to think about these questions if we're going to develop a more rounded and hopefully fruitful account of our party's history.
Thank you all. So I'm going to move on to questions from the audience now. So I'll pick out ones from the list. We've got quite a few here, so I don't think we'll get through all of them. So Bob Price is asking what themes from 1945 to 51 and 64 to 70 should we be drawing on in our current political positioning? Maybe I'll take two or three together. Is that, hopefully that's not too much. And then feel free to jump in on things that interest you. Steve mentioned, so this question, Marchant, Steve mentioned us missing out on the trumpeting the good things that we've done in the past. Do we also fail to learn from our mistakes? I think Patrick might have something to add from his recent book on that. Okay, let's start with those two because the rest are very long for me to read quickly. Should we start off with Steve? Because you had your hand.
Yeah, I had my pen up. Well, in terms of Bob's question, I think, I mean, I've said it already, and it does kind of evoke what the party's trying to do today, but it's also what the party was really in the past. And exemplified by the Attlee government in particular is being economically radical, being committed to making society fairer, more equal, while also being, patriotic, in a sort of conventional way. The party that helped establish NATO, for example, that you can be, those two things together. And that's kind of Labour's usual historical mix. And that's something, so that's sort of continuity with the present. So that would be the themes that I think would be most useful for the current Labour Party leadership, because it wasn't very appropriate for the previous Labour leadership, but they tried to ignore Attlee's support for NATO and whatever. So I think that it's quite a simple thing, but it's a persistent and a relevant theme. I think learning from mistakes. I mean, I mentioned criticism of Ed Miliband for daring to criticise New Labour. I think the problem when people in the Labour Party start to be try to learn from mistakes, that's when a lot of partisanship and factionalism comes in. So the Blairites didn't like the New Labour government being attacked because a lot of the attacks, I'm not saying Ed Miliband's were sort of bad faith attacks. So it's sort of, it would be nice to have a proper discussion about what those mistakes were. But I mean, just to take New Labour, there were people who were like Peter Hyman, who was Tony Blair's speechwriter and advisor, who left Tony Blair, the Number 10 operation in about, I think, 2003 or so, because he was frustrated with the fact that New Labour didn't develop into something more. So you can say, well, say 97, New Labour had a great strategy for getting elected, but it stuck with that strategy all the time. It just repeated it, and it didn't ever develop into something that I think some people, in the party hoped it would become a more social democratic, for want of a better term, kind of a government. But yeah, we always learn from mistakes, but the Labour Party is very bad from learning from its mistakes, if only because factionalism is the prism through which all Labour governments are seen. And some people, like Andrew Adonis, someone like Andrew Adonis, everything was perfect. Everything was perfect. Somebody like Ken Loach, everything was wrong. Everything was wrong. So the party's been bad at trying to find a nuanced response to its own time in government.
Patrick, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think Rob poses a really important question, and I'm reminded that in a way you can learn from history, but you can also learn from history in the wrong way, and in some senses you can also learn from history in a way that points you in the wrong direction. I mean, I think in one respect both Blair and Brown were deeply affected by an appreciation of what they perceived to be Labour's post-war economic history. I mean, I think they were extremely defensive about Labour's economic record. They basically swallowed the widespread view that Labour had, when it had been in office, mismanaged the economy, and that this had led to economic instability, rising inflation, industrial militancy, and so on. Now, of course, that's one reading of Britain's post-war history, but there's no doubt David would tell us there are many other readings, and actually Labour's record was actually far less negative than it's portrayed in that sense. So I think we have to be obviously wary and cautious about the historical interpretations that we're making. I think just to follow on from what Steve was saying, I think that is his point about Peter Hyman raises a very important question about how does a party which necessarily gets into office on a programme which is probably going to be relatively cautious then develop into a more transformational force. And for me, that's certainly what New Labour, in some respects, failed to do after 1997. That isn't to suggest that it doesn't have a very strong track record in all sorts of areas of economic and social policy. But what it didn't do was develop into a political force with a more transformational agenda that would have really reset many aspects of the way that the British economy and British society work. And I think if we can use history to think about that question of how to develop a programme from one that is fairly minimalist in office into one that becomes much more transformational, then that will be just one way alone in which history will make a very valuable contribution to the success of the Labour Party.
Yes, thank you. So one way I think in which New Labour went wrong is not actually ignoring history, as Stephen was suggesting, but actually in imbibing far too much Tory and Liberal history. And this speaks to Patrick's point that there was a very negative appreciation of what Labour had done, and New Labour buying into Tory accounts of the 1970s and 80s, for example. What to learn from 45 and 64? I think one very important thing is that Labour was systematically fighting a Tory view of the world and arguing for its own policies, increasing equality, increasing the sense of national belonging. So Labour's patriotism, and it was really there, was not the same as Tory patriotism. It was a different thing. So one of the great criticisms the Labour left and the Labour right made, more the Labour left in a way, was that the Tories and British capitalists were acting against the interests of the British nation. So it's not waving a Tory flag; it's waving a Labour national flag, which is central here. And I think that's something we very definitely have to get back to. I think believing the history of the Second World War is a story of Winston Churchill being the only anti-fascist in British history, and I've had Kwasi Kwarteng say this, is one we have to reject. We say no, the great anti-fascists, thank you very much, were the Labour Party in the 1930s. So I think Labour just needs to be confident that it took sides in history and was on the right side of history and stopped conceding ground to the Tories. But as I say, I think that is difficult because it has been conceding this ground since the since the 1990s, since the 1980s, I would say. What could Labour do better? Well, one thing that Labour has never properly done is political education, and we see the result of that in the very unsophisticated kind of factional disputes we have within the party. If we're going to have factional disputes, let's make them more sophisticated. Would be my ambition. Second is the consistent, pretty consistent hatred of the membership by certain sections of the leadership. Now, the Tory party has always hated its membership, especially its choice of furniture, but it's kept it very hidden. I mean, both from the membership and most certainly from the public. I think Labour is structured in a very different position in society. In a sense, it has to like itself in a way the Tory party needn't. And I think, I mean, it clearly hasn't, and it has lost a lot from its inability to kind of build a broad base in wider society, not least wider intellectual society. I mean, the great failing really at the intellectual level has been to build forms of, shall we say, social democratic knowledge, which are independent of the knowledge systems essentially tied to other political parties and other social forces. In some parts of continental Europe, there's been some success in that, but Labour has been utterly dependent, it seems to me, on expertise, forms of historical understanding from outside the party. And especially, it has to be said, in the last 40 years, with disastrous consequences. So Labour's got to get on the front foot intellectually, politically, ideologically, and its unwillingness even to try at the height of its power. I know that's a kind of a Ralph Milibandian and other critique, but I think it's fair and important. And when we look to the left, the great sources of political education were parties of the left, notably the Communist Party, as Labour didn't want to engage in that because essentially didn't trust its membership. I think it has to learn to do that, and it has to learn to learn. It has to learn to debate. It has to learn to think much more creatively than it has.
Thank you all for a really interesting discussion. There are loads of comments in the chat, so feel free. I found it really interesting to go through them. Lots of them are comments, but they're also questions, and you've definitely encouraged me to pick up that Clement Attlee biography that has been on my shelf for a couple of years now, unread. So thank you for that encouragement. We had one comment from Mary, which we're running over, so we're not going to be able to get into, but she had a really interesting point about should we start taking oral histories of older members so you don't lose that rich sort of understanding of party members and their experiences, which I think is a really good idea, and something whether those of us in academia or the party should definitely look into doing. So thank you to David, to Steve and to Patrick for your contributions today. Thank you to the audience for logging in and watching, and also for your really interesting comments and questions. And I really hope this is just the start of the discussion on how we can learn from our history in the party.